What's up, everyone? So for this video I wanted to go over really quickly some tips for someone that's just looking to get into air simulator battles. Air simulator battles, if you're not familiar, and I mean if you're watching this video you should be, but air simulator battles, you go over here, click on this air simulator battle, look at the room list, and you're presented with all of these enduring confrontation battles that you can participate in. And I just want to talk about a few things that if you're completely new to air sim, you should do first before hopping in. So like just some tips and some tricks and some settings you'll want to change, all of that jazz. So first off, if you've never flown sim, the best thing you can do is look for a tier, I would say a tier 2 aircraft, because tier 1 in the biplanes and the slower planes, you're not really going to get a good feel for how aircraft work in sim, especially biplanes. They work totally differently than your higher tier aircraft. So if you start there, you're going to experience a radical change into the way aircraft perform. And then in the higher tiers, you're going to be facing more advanced opponents. You're going to be using planes that have little room for error sometimes, and it's just going to be a lot harder. So actually a great beginner plane for the Americans is the P-40. I love that plane in sim. It's one of my favorites. The Germans, the 109s can be tricky, but they are good planes if you learn to fly them. Just know that the German planes are typically harder to master. But I would typically say, again, rank 2, stick in this area. For the Russians, I actually hate the way Russian planes fly in sim. I find them to be terrible, but that's just me. You could try any of these. I mean, I don't have a preference. I flat spin in all of them, but again, stick with rank 2. The British Spitfires, I would definitely recommend flying these first. The early Spitfires, rank 2, would be perfect. I'd actually recommend it over the Hurricane because it's a little bit more forgiving of a plane. Japan is a nice one because all of their planes are super forgiving. I actually really enjoyed flying the Ki-45s. I found that they got me home every time. I wouldn't always get a kill with them, but I could take shots and actually make it home all the time. It was a very forgiving planes, very easy to fly for a beginner. Then the Italians, I haven't played them much, but the C-202 should probably be a great plane. For the French, the French is probably the one category I would say to make the exception for and try with rank 3, simply because the D520 is kind of like the French equivalent of the Spitfire, and that's a great plane to fly in at first. The others can be, they're okay, but the D520 is a great beginner sim plane for French. So yeah, first tip is to choose a plane to start with and then know what planes to start with. I'm going to go ahead and take this P-40 into a custom battle, and I'll show you the next tip. I guess I have to choose a crew, huh? No, test flight. So we're going to go ahead and take this in, and I highly recommend, if you've never flown sim before, this is basically a necessity, is to take a plane, go into a test battle or a test drive, turn it on to simulator battles, go ahead and set all this to whatever you want, and then just hop in. And for future reference, I would definitely recommend to change your fuel amount in sim. A lot of the times in RB you're going to have the minimum load, but in sim you're going to be flying around for a while. So this is kind of like a little mini tip. I usually set it to 45 minutes. It's probably a little overkill. 30 minutes is usually good, but there's just those times when I'm running 30 minutes and I'm getting back to base in 5 minutes of fuel, and I'd rather have that little bit extra. So take your plane into custom, or into a test drive, and I'm going to show you what you should focus on doing before you even get into a simulator match. This is kind of like, you have to do this first, otherwise you're going to be a waste. So you're going to get on the airfield, you're in this cockpit view. A little trick, you can hop out of the cockpit while you're on the airfield, but it'll kind of boot you right back in as you start to take off. So I is going to turn on your engine. Go ahead and set your flaps to take off if you've got it. It's going to be a big help. From there, I actually like to check my surfaces and make sure they're working. Not for the fact that they're not going to work in this game. You know, like in real life, you check them and make sure they work. But just for the fact that sometimes I'll mix up my key placements and I'll have my fingers on the rudders as opposed to the ailerons or something stupid like that, and then I botch the takeoff. So sometimes it's nice to look over and just make sure you've got your fingers in the right place. So you have your engine started, and a little tip is don't start your engine at full throttle. You can actually flood the engine. A viewer of mine passed that info on to me. Once your engine's started and your flaps are at takeoff, you're going to start moving up the power. If you're first taking off, I would recommend starting at around 30%. This will give you a feel for which way the plane starts to pull. So you can see the plane's pulling to the right just a little bit. So you're going to start tapping the Q key, so the left rudder to counter that, right? And I'm going to start applying more throttle, making sure that we have that thrust countered good. Let's see here. And you're just going to be tapping those rudder keys. And now I don't normally recommend for a new player to take off at web, but I do it all the time just because I like to get off the airfield fast. And once you have the basics of a plane down, you can do that. So then put the gear up, put the flaps up. I try to get those up before 150 miles per hour. That's a habit from the British planes because they have very weak gear and flaps and they'll rip off at 150 miles exactly, basically. And then once you're up, don't try to make too many maneuvers once you've just taken off, otherwise you'll flat spin. And there you're good to go. So now you've taken off, and maybe you botched the takeoff, maybe you slid into a tree or something, maybe you didn't counter the rudder hard enough or you countered too hard, that's fine. Just keep practicing until you can take off smoothly. I even botch a takeoff every now and then. Once you're in the air, get up to some speed and start to fly around. The first thing I want to show you or teach you is kind of when you're going to enter a flat spin, because that's probably the biggest thing that's going to kill a new player. You're not going to get killed by planes, you're going to get killed by flat spinning. And so a flat spin is generally going to occur if you have your aileron and your rudder both hard in the same direction. So I'll show you right now. So here we go, aileron and rudder, and you can see instant loss of control, and I'm in a flat spin, right? So at this point, to recover from the flat spin, what I normally like to do is turn off the engine, rudder and aileron hard in the opposite direction, point the nose down, start turning that engine back on, and try to lift her up out. Now I flat spinned with a terribly low altitude, so that was a tough and dodgy one there, but that's generally what you're going to need to do. So again, you're going to flat spin if you have your aileron and rudder both hard in the same direction. It's a guaranteed flat spin if you do that. Most of the time this is going to occur when you're trying to pull a really hard turn. If you try to pull this all the way that way, the AI instructor, well, no, not even the AI instructor. If you try to put it all the way this way, most of the time it's going to put you right then and there. But if you ever want to intentionally flat spin, which is great to practice, just hit A and Q or D and E and you'll enter a flat spin. I recommend gaining a little bit of altitude so you can learn to recover. So we're going to go ahead and head up to about 3,000 feet here. Let's see. All right, we're at about 3,000, and I'm going to go ahead and hit D and E. I'm going to hit it hard, and you'll see the plane should nearly instantly enter a flat spin. Didn't hit it hard enough. Let's do it again one more time, and there we go. That's a flat spin. So again, cut the engine, rudder and aileron in the opposite direction. Try to pitch that nose down, and once we start pitching that down, you'll see we may not recover from this one. But yeah, generally you're going to want to try to get the rudder and aileron the opposite direction. We actually started to get control right before we hit the ground there. But yeah, generally you're going to want to try to hit the rudder in the opposite direction, pitch the nose down, and hit the aileron in the opposite direction as well. And try to get the spin counteracted first, and then once you're still going down, you're going to be still flying straight down. You're going to slowly pull up. You can't pull up hard because you'll enter a flat spin all over again, but just slowly pull up. And so once you've practiced taking off and recovering from a flat spin a few times, you can practice landing. It's daunting, I will say that. Even now, it's daunting for me to land a plane. But once you've got a little bit of practice under your belt, you should have it fine. And in Sim, you're generally going to have plenty of time to land your plane. You're not generally going to have any enemies on your tail or anything. So you don't have to worry if you need to come around for another pass. Plus, since the game mode's longer with Enduring Confrontation, you have matches can be like 2 hours. You should have no issue with taking your time to land. It's not going to cost you anything. So once you've practiced flat spinning, knowing when you're going to flat spin, and recovering from the flat spin, and I mean, again, you don't have to recover every time, but just kind of get familiar with it and understand when the plane is about to enter a flat spin, and the general basics of how to recover. And so once you understand that, I would say start to try to learn landing. So for a landing, you're going to simply come around, and we have a little bit low speed here, so it'll be easier to show. A lot of the times after a fight, we're coming near the airfield around like 300 miles per hour or something. But for landing, generally what I like to do is cut the throttle. I like to cut the throttle down to like 50%, let the plane slow down quite a bit. As I'm approaching, I kind of scope out the airfield, I head in, and you can see here, this plane is already really slow, but I just cut the throttle, start to dive to get rid of that altitude and bleed that all out. And then once we get around to the other side, I make a turn, and I'll show you that in a second. And just peeking around. Alright, we're going to go ahead and turn now. And normally, oh, I forgot to take, oh no, I don't know. I might have forgotten to raise flaps. So now we're going to turn around. I like to set my flaps to combat at this point. We're going to cut the throttle to about, actually we'll cut the throttle to 0 here because we're watching for that speed. We want to get down to about 150 so we can get that gear out. Okay, gears down. We're going to set the flaps to landing, and we're going to start putting the throttle back on now. I find that after you set landing flaps, your plane's going to slow down a lot faster than you expect it to. At least this is my take. So your plane will start really slowing down, and it's best to turn the throttle back on, and it'll lead to a nice, smooth landing. Once we're over, we can cut the throttle, and we'll have a touchdown, a little bit of a bounce, but that's generally the way I land my planes, and it works out most of the time. Here we go. Just kind of pull into a halt here. You can also use a little bit of rudder to help you stop sooner, but be careful because you never want to pitch the plane over. There we go, and you're landed. You're good to go. You can shoot a couple times to force it to reload, and there you go. And that's kind of it. You just want to practice stalling, practice a flat spin, practice your takeoff, and practice your landing. Then you should be ready to fly in sim, but what I would advise is not to fly in air sim, fly in tank sim instead. And this is why. So when you play air sim, you're generally going to be facing... Generally, the people who are flying in air sim are, I would say, higher caliber players, because in tank sim, you get a mixture, right? Some of the people fly in sim, so they know how to fly in sim, but others are people who've just brought their tanks and they're just using their plane for a backup, right? And so the nice thing about tank sim is if you fly in that, right, and let's say you take your plane out first and then your tanks second, if you die in your plane and you do nothing in it, you won't be any waste to your team. You'll be fine. Like it doesn't impact the game big time. And then it also gives you a nice mix of ground targets to bomb and strafe at and rocket. I really recommend learning to bomb in sim first. It's a really nice way to learn how to control your plane, how to spot targets and all that. And then you also typically will get a nice mix of targets like a Ju-87, a Duck, twin engines even sometimes. You get some Japanese twin engine fighters, stuff of that sort. And those targets are great targets to practice on. And you're going to find those in tank sim a lot more than you'll find them in air sim. And just general, like, you know, flying, if you bring a, I mean, let's see here. This one, for example, you could bring a P-47, right? And you're facing a Ju-87. A P-47 versus Ju-87, that should be an easy matchup. And it'll give you great experience. Then once you feel comfortable, you can swap over to air sim, and I'll warn you, it's going to be a little bit higher quality of opponents, because the guys playing here are typically going to be, they're going to know what they're doing most of the time. Where tank sim, sometimes you get people who don't. And so it's going to be harder opponents, but it'll be lots of fun. You got lots of different tasks to do within the mission, and you're going to get a lot of RP. You might lose a few silver lions every now and then, but you'll get a lot of RP doing this. The other tips I would have is to take a look at your controls. So you're going to want to head in here, head into aircraft control, head into full wheel controls, and you're going to want to make sure that your controls are all set up properly. A lot of people like to open the bomb bay door as a separate thing from space. I typically just leave it default, and I hit my space bar once before I'm ready to drop my bombs, and then I start dropping bombs. Dropping bomb series, that can be a nice one to add on there. Let's see what else. The really important ones, though, we'll get down to in a second. So really important ones you're going to want to look at are... So first off, I use mouse as a joystick, so mouse keyboard, and I don't have any problems doing that. I can be somewhat competitive in dogfights, so I wouldn't be afraid to play AirSim if you're just using a mouse and keyboard. However, I will say that I've heard it's easier to play with a controller, an Xbox or a PS4 controller, and a lot of people who have joysticks, joysticks are considered king. But this is the section that you should really take the time to set up, is manual engine control. It's helpful in bombers, but it's especially helpful when your engine's taken some damage and you need to really manage it. So I have mine set up like this. Basically, I can turn on the manual engine control by hitting my num5, and then I have mixture, propeller pitch, and radiator controls. And I'll be honest, I have no clue what any of these really do. I mean, I have some idea, but mixture, I typically just keep at 100%. When I'm manually controlling things, propeller pitch, I also typically just keep at 100%. The radiator is where things can get, is really the only one I change right now. The radiator and there's another control that I'll have to find, but prop feathering. The radiator and prop feathering are really the only two things that I mess with. So the radiator, if you have your auto engine control, typically it'll set the radiator to something like 10%, 5%, or even 0% open. And this means that the flaps that expose the radiator air and let the air in and cooling the radiator are shut. And it's better for speed because it reduces drag, but in the event that your engine's shot and you're having some heat problems, I find that it's always nice to throw manual engine control on and hit the radiator and bring that all the way up to 100% opening. Setting these up for the first time might be a little bit tricky if you're not familiar with the, hold up, I got a call, give me a second. Hey, what's up? All right, call's over. So when you're setting these up for the first time, you might think it's as easy as, max value, minimal value, set that up, but you actually need to make sure you make sure you put on relative control. This is important because if you don't put on relative control, it won't keep the value you leave it at. So if you set page up, page down for your radiator and you don't hit relative control, right, then it'll, when you're pressing page up, be at 100%, but when you let go, it'll restore to 50%. So relative control, you got to make sure you leave that on. And that's it for setting those up. Prop feathering, this is a good one if your plane engine is dead and you're trying to glide back to base. What prop feathering does, actually, I don't totally know what prop feathering does. I think it locks the prop in place so that it doesn't spin or something of that nature. It reduces your drag. That's all I know, is by enabling prop feathering, it reduces your drag and it'll help you make it back to home just a little bit. Other than that, once you have these controls set up, you should be good to go. And that's it. I haven't messed with any of these sensitivities, but feel free to mess with that if you are, if you're having any trouble. But I haven't messed with any of these. I've left it all at the default. Oh, I would take this off. I actually have been meaning to do that. Take off trim from T, because it reduces you, like if you have trim set as T, when you go to press T42, for example, you will you'll set your aircraft trim and it will, like, for example, let's say you're turning and you press T42, then your aircraft will want to always turn since it's set to leave the rudder and the ailerons in that position. However, it is a useful I need to set this too. It is a useful thing, trimming, especially when you've taken some damage and your aircraft's pulling to one side, as you can set the trim to stay, keeping the aircraft level. So I'm actually going to take the time right now while I'm in this video to set that up and figure out what key I want to do it with. Can I use this? Yes, I can. There we go. Trim set. And actually, I'll go through here and change my prop feathering key to this. There we go. So yeah, set up your trim to something other than T so that you can communicate with your team still, and you'll be good. And that's it. That's it for the controls. That's it for the those kind of tips there. Some people are curious whether different graphics settings change your ability to see in sim. From what I understand, there's not a big impact. If you're on ultra low, you'll be able to see targets up close slightly better, but targets that are far away may not render. However, it won't be a big impact versus higher graphics where sure they may render far away, but they're still going to be tiny specks that you have to work really hard to see. And so graphics, I wouldn't worry about those making too big of a deal. The only other thing I would say is learn to always scan, always be moving, always be like not moving, but moving your head, always be looking around and searching for the next target, because that's kind of the biggest thing in AirSim is just having situational awareness. Other than that, those are my tips. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comments below and whether you guys have any tips of your own to share. And I hope to see you guys in the skies sometime soon. Cheers, everyone.